Recorded live from Hong Kong and Toronto. Let's go! This is the PR and Law Podcast.
The PR and Law Podcast.
Turn it up. With your hosts, Cam McMurchie and Ewan Christie.
Welcome to episode number 28 of the PR and Law Podcast. I'm your host, Cam McMurchie, along with Ewan Christie.
Hello, Cameron.
Ewan's an employment lawyer and partner at Duntroon LLP in Toronto, Canada, and his firm is online at duntroon.law. I'm a PR guy based in Hong Kong and publisher of the Digital Bits PR and Communications newsletter at digitalbitspr.com. If you enjoy the podcast, please tell a friend about it. That means a lot to us. You can also follow us on social media, LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. We're on all of those. The account name is PRLawPodcast. And you can subscribe to our YouTube channel or SoundCloud if you'd rather listen and subscribe that way. And we have a newsletter that's running, and it's nice to see that growing at PRLawPodcast.club. So please sign up for that so you don't miss a show. PRLawPodcast.club. Ewan, how's it going?
I'm good. Back in the fair city of Toronto.
Back in civilization.
Toronto. This is, and this happens with people wherever you live, right? That people who aren't from there always say your city in sort of a bizarro kind of way. And I always find it funny when I hear people say the city's name that aren't from here, particularly Americans. They actually, the enunciation is very, very clear and concise. It's sort of Toronto, but of course, everybody who's actually from here or live here, we just say Toronto. You just let those T's roll. Through.
A good example of this it drives me crazy, but I don't blame people at the same time. It's Beijing. Because if you know any Chinese, or even if you just hear it mentioned around, it's Beijing, not Beijing. And that is so common. But it seems it's one that I will not correct, but that's the one that gets under my skin the most, probably.
Well, what about, actually, you raise a good point. What about people who put, the emphasis on different syllables with regard to Hong Kong? Because I say Hong Kong, but, in the United States, it seems to be predominantly pronounced Hong Kong.
Yeah,
the emphasis. Have you noticed?
How's it going in Hong Kong? Yeah, I have noticed that. Although
I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know if there's a right or a wrong here. It's just sort of a difference I've noticed in the way that it's pronounced.
Yeah, and despite living here for more than a decade, I don't think there is a proper way, whichever way you kind of want to do it. But speaking of Hong Kong, Ewan, one of the things I wanted to mention off the top here, and I kind of wanted to ask you about last week about traveling during COVID, but it came out this week that Hong Kong and Singapore have signed an agreement. And as of next month, there will be travel between the two places without any quarantine, without any of those kind of requirements. And it's the first kind of bubble that's opened up in Asia like this. But the interesting thing is, as soon as the deal was signed, obviously, even I was looking at flights. I thought, hey, Singapore is nice. It's not that far away. You can pop down there. Right away, the prices of airline tickets skyrocketed because everyone has
of course
the same idea in both places. So I think I still have to wait a while.
Wow. Yeah. And I'm sure the same thing happened with hotels. All of a sudden, prices for accommodation probably went through the roof as well.
Yeah. And then the other thing this week too, and I don't know if you've seen much of it in Canada. I know it's sort of in the international news, but Thailand is going through a very big protest movement at the moment. It actually looks similar to Hong Kong last year, with thousands of people blocking roads and demanding basically democracy. And that's been, Thailand's an interesting place because it goes through military coups. I think there's been 6 of them. And recently, several of those are recent, and the country still ticks along fine. I mean, the GDP there is relatively high for Southeast Asia. They're growing quickly. There's a lot of foreign direct investment into the country, but there's a big standoff there now, and it has to do with the monarchy, which has traditionally been really sensitive. So it's I think another example of just the unrest that's kind of gone around the world in the last several years.
Yeah, well, and also how it's just been depicted and disseminated through media, right? Whereby you can have people in a particular country that can look elsewhere and say, well, hey, if they're doing it, why can't we do it too?
Yeah, absolutely. And there is a similar call in all of these. I would say even in the United States, like there's call for just more representation, more understanding, more fairness, I guess. to some degree. And yeah, we're living in a very volatile time. Anything else you want to mention, Ewan?
No, only that, you'd sort of asked about what was travel like.
Yes.
And I have to say it was, everything was very, very, very well done. Going through Pearson International in Toronto, which is an insanely busy airport at the best of times. It was just a quick in and out. There was no traffic. There were no lines. Everybody was social distanced, masked. And the same for the airlines themselves.
On that point, I have a good friend named Steve Chow, actually, who might be known in your city. He was a reporter for CTV for a very long time. And now
that's
he's
right. I remember him.
Al Jazeera. He took a photo on his Instagram. He's on his way to Washington, D.C. And the picture is scary because it's him sitting in his airline seat with the visors, the plastic visors that come down across your entire face, and then a mask under that. And he said both are required for the entire flight.
Continue the debate with us on social media. Join us on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at PRLawPodcast. All one word, PRLAW Podcast. Send us your questions now by email to askus@PRLawPodcast.com. That's all one word, askus@PRLawPodcast.com. Or on social media with the hashtag PRLawPod. That's hashtag PRLAWPOD.
All right, Ewan, we talked about last week. We saw a lot of interest online on the subject you spoke about last week. And so I'm excited to find out what you've got on deck today.
Well, this week, Cam, I wanted to talk about workplace investigations. And I know, we've sort of discussed this really briefly on some prior episodes, but I kind of wanted to do a deeper dive. It's becoming more and more commonplace in the employment context. And, I get asked a lot of questions about workplace investigations, either by employers who are looking to conduct one, or by employees who find themselves subject to one. So I thought it might be a good topic for us to touch on this week.
Yeah, so this is a really broad subject, right? Because you could have a workplace investigation that's sort of expansive for some criminal behavior or just HR issues. Like it seems like there's a lot falls under this category.
Well, yeah, you're absolutely right. I've attended all day seminars discussing this topic. You can take courses that last weeks on it. So, to suggest that we're going to do the issue justice in a small segment on our show, we're not. We're just not. So we're going to take some very, very broad strokes. But of course, if anybody has any comments or questions following this, then maybe we can sort of expand on that in subsequent episodes.
Yeah, absolutely. So go ahead.
One of the first questions that employers ask themselves when faced with a complaint, right? And this is really where the workplace investigation comes about. You have a complainant that comes forward, or perhaps several complainants with a concern or an issue. It could be something around discrimination or sexual harassment, any number of issues that employees bring forward. And the employer is sort of left in a situation where, they do have some duty in most jurisdictions to investigate the matter and look into it. So the next question becomes, well, how do we do that? What does that look like? And, the first question an employer has to ask themselves is, do we want to deal with this internally, or do we want to go externally? And, sometimes, Cam, the scope of the investigation, it doesn't require retaining an outside expert. Sometimes you can deal with this internally through your HR department or through management. However, the issue there is always going to be the risk of bias, right? It's always going to be more pronounced when an internal investigator is tasked to look into it. And, and that's just kind of an obvious point by nature of their position in the company, right? That they may lack a certain independence or impartiality that an external investigator can bring to the table.
Yeah, and it's that appearance of potential conflict, right? Like or bias, because maybe the internal investigators are doing things properly and by the book and without judgment, but people have to feel that and think that and observe that as well. And there's just that suspicion if it's an internal investigation.
Yeah, absolutely, right. And these are sort of, I think kind of the chief concerns, and that you sort of jumped right ahead in talking about that apprehension of bias. I mean, that's always going to be the largest concern, whether you're dealing with an internal investigator or an external investigator. So, here's just a couple of quick bullet points, Cam, in terms of what you can do to sort of stay away from any accusations or, any apprehension of bias. So the first point is
sorry, Ewan, is this from the company's perspective, from management who's going to execute on an investigation? Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry.
Yes,
Go
absolutely.
ahead.
This is from management's perspective. And actually, I guess before we get there, before we talk about apprehension of bias, let's talk about mandate. So let's assume for a moment that the company decides, well, you know what, we're concerned about an apprehension of bias in terms of dealing with this internally. So we're going to hire an external investigator. Well, the first thing is make sure you get the right investigator to do it. What are the issues that are on the table that are being dealt with? Because that's going to determine the type and specific investigator that you bring in. And, there's all kinds of really, really sensitive issues that you have to look at and address here, Cam. So for example, let's say the complaint involves a group of women and they're all persons of color and they're raising allegations of sexual harassment. Well, in that particular context, bringing in someone that looks like me, for example, a 40-something white male may not be the best investigator for the job. Not because I don't have any particular experience doing the work, but because I may not be conscious of particular issues, because my lived experience is going to be markedly different than that of a woman of color. So again, it doesn't mean you can't bring in that white male investigator, but it's a consideration. It's something to look at, something to consider. And make sure the mandate is clear, right? Mm-hmm. So, who does the investigator need to speak with? What are the timelines? What are the sensitivities? When investigations go bad, they usually go bad because that clear mandate hasn't been established by the employer before the investigator has been chosen and retained, Cam. So that's really, really, really important. Get all your ducks in a row before you pick up the phone and call somebody to come in and look at what's going on.
Mm-hmm. Got it.
And then we talked about that apprehension of bias, right? So here's a couple bullets to consider if you're an employer and you're bringing somebody in to investigate, to make sure that the investigator, even if it's an internal person, you have to make sure that they stay neutral, right? So that any evidence that witnesses are being asked pursuant to an investigation, that you're not asking them leading questions. Leading questions demonstrate that there's some sort of prejudgment of the issues on the part of the investigator, right? So stay neutral in the questions that you're putting to witnesses. Be consistent that, any sort of disparate treatment of the various parties being investigated, and inherently you're going to land in some apprehension of bias. So if you have a complainant that you're interviewing and then you have a respondent that you're interviewing, you can't go really aggressive with regard to one and then really restrained with the other. The approach should be consistent from one witness to the next.
Yeah, this is all good. Yeah, keep going.
Yeah, keep your notes. Make sure your investigator keeps their notes, right? Destruction of any sort of investigation evidence can be construed as bias. Don't go on fishing expeditions. And again, this sort of goes back to the mandate, right? The mandate should establish the scope of the investigation. And then the scope of that investigation should mirror that mandate, and it should mirror what the actual complaint being made is. We don't want people going down rabbit holes when you're conducting the interviews. Stay focused, stay on task, and stick with what's on the table in terms of the mandate. And then sort of that last bullet, Cam, is whoever the ultimate decision maker is, whoever internally for the employer is going to be the one pulling the trigger around any disciplinary measures here, they should stay out of the fact-finding interviews. And again, because that's just for the simple reason that it may unfairly influence the outcome of the investigation.
Right. That last one there, I think, is a really good point. Well, I mean, I think they all are. I mean, Ewan, I guess my question out of all of this, I think that's good. And I know it's in management's interest to do this properly, and to sort of make sure that everything is done by the book and according to sort of rules and procedures to protect themselves down the line in case there's a problem. But in terms of when an investigation is underway internally in a company, you talked about being able to interview or talk to the staff involved. What other tools do they have, or what other things do they have access to try and piece a story together or piece, evidence of a problem together?
Right. Well, I mean, part of the fact-finding process could involve any number of things. So, company emails, that's usually one of the first places you go. Is there anything in writing that we can sort of point to and review and examine that might give us some direction in terms of what the issues are? Are there text messages? Anything along those lines, any social media posts that may speak to the issues that are being raised in the complaint. So those are good places to start. And then, of course, the interviews themselves. And this can be a difficult step in the process. Who do you interview? How do you determine who the appropriate people are? If a complainant comes forward and addresses one name, and then you interview the respondent, and that individual raises 4 or 5 other people who can speak in their defense. Well, do you have to interview all 4 or 5 of those individuals? So there's a lot of these sort of considerations that can come up real time during the investigation. But, one thing that you have to be really, really conscious of, Cam, when conducting the investigation, and again, as an employer, this is a relevant point, whether you're dealing with it internally or whether you've retained somebody externally, is that anybody that you have sort of pointed the finger at as committing some sort of wrong based on allegations that have been raised by a complainant, they have certain rights in this process. So, as an employee, the employer doesn't have carte blanche to sort of drag you through the mud. If they intend to bring you forward to be interviewed for the purposes of an investigation, here are some sort of key points that they need to establish as well. I mean, the employee in this case has the right to know the evidence against them prior to being examined. So you have to, whether you're relying on emails or text messages, whatever the accusations are or the allegations are, the employee has to be provided with some idea, some sense as to what it is that they're facing before you sit down and examine them.
Ewan, on this point, this kind of harkens back to what we talked about last week a little bit when dealing with your managers or your superiors. If there's an investigation and you are called into a room with 1 or 2 or 3 or more people to interview you or talk to you about something, this is another example where I think the employee probably wouldn't feel comfortable sort of asking for the evidence against them that has been collected already. I wish employees would be bold enough to do that, but I can see why this would be something very difficult for them to do, yet something very important for them to do also.
Yeah, absolutely. And, and I've, some employees in these situations, they want to retain counsel to sort of aid them in this process. And that's certainly something you can do. And I've certainly represented employees in these circumstances where they've been asked to come in to speak to a particular allegation and they haven't been provided with all the evidence. Well, in that circumstance, that situation, no, the employee doesn't have an obligation to simply walk into a firestorm when they haven't been provided with all the information. So yeah, if you're an employee and you're sort of faced with that situation, you may want to sit down with counsel. And again, the level of involvement can vary. I mean, it can be in an extreme case that employee retains counsel who represents them, who attends any sort of interviews pursuant to the investigation with the employee to make sure the investigation is being conducted properly. And then they're not being asked any questions that fall outside the scope of, the particular mandate. It may also be that you are on the sidelines as counsel, providing some advice and perhaps, ghostwriting written statements or responses to inquiries around the allegation from the employer. So, there's different roles that counsel can play here. But I mean, if you do find yourself subject to an investigation as an employee, you may want to take the time to sort of sit down with counsel on it.
Yeah, just as a general rule. And I think these things probably my guess is people probably don't know these 2 points that you just made, which is one, if you're part of an investigation or the target of one, that you should ask for the information or the evidence against you. And then two, if you don't get it, that you have some recourse kind of. So to talk to a lawyer if you haven't already at that stage. I think this is sort of golden information for people. I didn't know that employees had these rights myself.
Well, again, and we, like everything else on this show, Cam, we always have to throw proper caveats, salt in that gargantuan disclaimer that what employees are entitled to and what employers are entitled to do varies from jurisdiction and country to country, right? So these are sort of some broad strokes and broad principles, but again, all the more reason to sort of sit down with counsel who can give you some further advice in terms of what the specific requirements are or the specific restrictions are wherever it is that you may live. Now, I just wanted to quickly try and whip through a few more of these. Sure. These points in terms of what a complainant what a respondent is entitled to if somebody does level allegations and you find yourself subject to a workplace investigation. So we talked about the right, the evidence to be provided to you before being examined. That individual also should be given an opportunity to provide a full response to whatever that evidence is. And again, this does go back, Cam, as you mentioned, to the, performance improvement plans that we talked about last week. Just because you're faced with a series of allegations or complaints doesn't mean you're not entitled to provide your perspective or your account of events. So, really, if you want to conduct an appropriate investigation as an employer, you have to give that individual an opportunity to respond to the allegations. They also have the right to call any additional witnesses to support their position or to counter any of that evidence that already has been offered. So that's important too. And that's pretty common that, somebody who's faced with allegations of wrongdoing and pursuant to a workplace investigation, they're going to say talk to Bill, talk to Sue, talk to Sally. They can give you some perspective on these allegations and can confirm that, there's nothing to them. So you have to look into that stuff, right? So these are, again, this is all very, very broad strokes, I understand, but really things that employers should be conscious of when looking at conducting investigation. When these things come up, Cam, employers always want to have them done right away, right? They want to get the problem solved. They want to get it dealt with. They want to move quickly. And I can understand that. And I've often find myself on the receiving end of it when employers we want to have this done within a week. It's well, if we need to talk to 7 or 8 witnesses, we're not going to have this done in a week. It's not going to be done. That's not how it works. You need to take time. There needs to be procedural fairness in the process. And the reality is that you don't want to cut corners, because if you could cut corners and you ultimately end up terminating an individual who is subject to some of these allegations, and they retain counsel, and then that counsel, wisely so, starts poking around in terms of the context and the procedures of the investigation, and find that there was all kinds of corners that were cut and holes in the process. Well, you could find yourself with the whole thing being thrown out. Right.
Or it's worse. The last question I have on this, Ewan, really is just in the clients that you have worked with in the past, or that your other partners or other colleagues or people in the profession, what would be the number one thing that employers tend to do wrong or tend to misunderstand or sort of misinterpret when they're starting these things or want to start an investigation?
Great question. And I would say that the number one issue that I come across on this point is employers failing to provide adequate disclosure to employees that they turn around and terminate pursuant to a complaint that was raised, that they don't provide the employee with the evidence against them, and they don't provide the employee with an opportunity to respond to the allegations. That's it. That's the biggest thing. I have defended a whole host of employees who have found themselves in those situations where I've turned around and I've said to the employer, sorry, this isn't going to fly. You didn't provide my client with any of the evidence against them. You didn't provide them with an opportunity to respond. And that's a big, big problem for you in your case. So employers, again, I know you want to try and deal with the situation quickly. That's fine. If you're looking to try and move quickly, bring somebody in who can help you and make sure that things are done properly and you're not cutting these corners. Because again, if you don't tick off all the right boxes, then the whole thing may be for naught in the end.
Ewan, I understand. Sorry, now I have a follow-up question. So this is my last question. Why wouldn't the employers present the evidence? It seems to me like it would be in their interest to share that with the employee. I understand how maybe they would end up not giving them an opportunity to respond. I can see that happening. Like if you have evidence against somebody that's damning or definitive, then you feel like you don't need to talk to them. So that's a good one. But why wouldn't they share the information?
Yeah, I mean, great question. I don't know. I mean, I think if I was to sort of speculate, at least based on my experience, again, it's often there's either some broken telephone going on internally where management is communicating with HR and they're speaking about these allegations and they simply say, just get rid of this individual, let them go. And then you have a poorly drafted termination letter, which raises allegations of wrongdoing, but then provides no clarification as to what that wrongdoing was. I can also recall a case I dealt with where an individual was contacted over the phone and presented over the phone with management on the call. He was completely, blindsided and presented with all of these things that he had allegedly done. And then, the employer said, what's your response to this? And, my client said, well, hey, I don't know. I didn't do any of this stuff. I can tell you. I mean, I've never heard of this. I didn't do it. And they said, well, we think you did. So we're letting you go effective immediately. And the whole conversation lasted nothing more than about 10 minutes and that individual was gone. So, again, the employer in that circumstance may have thought, well, hey, we did our due diligence. We called him, we told him what he did wrong, and then we subsequently let him go. But you didn't really give him an opportunity to respond. He was blindsided. He wasn't provided with anything in writing. And you can't really argue that, an appropriate investigation was conducted over the course of a 10-minute phone call. So again, it's just sometimes employers are cutting corners or, they just don't think. But that procedural fairness, that issue, it's really, really critical to an investigation that's going to be upheld if it ever finds its way into a courtroom.
Yeah, and these are uncomfortable. I know management doesn't enjoy doing these investigations, and obviously employees don't either. So hopefully it's not something that people deal with a lot. But if you do, this is certainly valuable things to keep in mind.
Show your support to the PR and Law podcast by making a one-time donation or setting up a subscription with us on Patreon. Every little bit helps us keep the lights on and bring the show to you each week. If you'd like to chip in, please visit PRLawPodcast.com. That's PRLawPodcast.com. Click support the show. Thanks for helping us out.
I won't blame you if you don't know the answer to this, Ewan, but I will ask it right off the top. Are you familiar or do you know about content marketing?
I feel like you blindside me on this.
I know.
Every weekend. I mean, I'm starting to feel like a bit of a clown here.
Well, the reason I asked
content marketing, I mean, I know I understand what content means. I understand what marketing means. I have some sense as to what I think content marketing means, but I bet it doesn't mean what you're going to tell me it means.
Well, I ask because you are a very well-educated, smart, erudite individual. So this proves the point that content marketing is not that well known. And that's why I sort of bring it up. It is not really new, but it has picked up a lot of momentum, I guess, especially with COVID-19. And it's a key tool, I think, in a communicator's sort of arsenal. This is a little bit more on the marketing side, but not necessarily. I think it can be used for a number of different things. So in short, content marketing is creating content an article, a video, a blog, an infographic, something that you can post on your website or somewhere, the company's website, that is picked up in search engine optimization. So Google's crawling and finds that article and then indexes it. And then you get more exposure. So if you have a regular company, you may have an about page, and you might have the homepage and maybe a contact us and products and services offered, whatever those might be. But then you would want to have a blog or a news section or something, because once Google indexes your sort of company information, that's good. If someone's searching for your company, they will find you, right? But if someone is searching for, in your case, Ewan, an employment lawyer in Toronto, then it's an issue, because they wouldn't know what your partnership is or what your name of the firm is. So it would be more difficult without advertising and things like that. So content marketing is really to kind of address this issue. And it is heavily tied in with the SEO, search engine optimization, as I mentioned earlier. And this is something that is actually getting more and more complicated. But there are services online where you can search for your subject area. So let's say you're a sporting goods store and you sell tennis rackets or something like that. If you type in tennis rackets, it will come back, these services, and tell you this is what people are searching for on about tennis rackets. These are the questions being asked. And you can take this information and go onto your own website, your own blog, write something, create something that answers these questions, because it's automatically linking to the people asking it, because you already know that it's a big question that a lot of people are asking. And this link brings people into your company because they're searching for something. They see an article on something, they click it, and before they know it, they're on your company's website. And once they're there, then you can sort of market or sell or, do something to kind of retain them. So does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. So basically you're saying, your natural inclination is, as a business owner developing a website, is you want to tell prospective customers what it is that you do. But it sounds like what you're suggesting is what would be almost better is to go and search for what specifically it is that customers are looking for, and then tell them how you can address those issues. Is that sort of what you're saying?
It might not even be that directly related. So in the tennis racket example, the article wouldn't be about you offering tennis rackets at a good price. It would be a legitimate, interesting, researched article about tennis rackets. And what it's meant to do is to give you sort of thought leadership in the space and to sort of show your knowledge and, maybe institutional history in this field that ultimately wins them over time. And the one thing that you absolutely don't want to do in content marketing is hard sell, because people don't want to read an ad. They tune out very fast in those cases. So a lot of the best content marketing is legit articles. And, there's one interesting wrinkle that I see a lot now. If you're, for instance, now doing an online business and you're offering software or a product or something in a specific field, what a lot of these companies have done is written an article called, top 10 CRM software or top 10 ice hockey skates or whatever it might be. And on that list, they will put their item first, but legitimately review the others and put maybe, 9 more underneath, linking to their competitors and doing that sort of thing. But the thing is, people sometimes don't know what page they're on, and this is a good opportunity for you to sell in comparison to your competitors. Because oftentimes when you want to buy something, Ewan, like in your case, speakers, for instance, if it was something sort of media related, you may end up on a website that talks about, the speakers that they believe and they've tested that are the best, which happen to be their own. But because you've already got the reader on the page, you've already got their attention, how you write the things, how you write the paragraphs, how you structure the arguments can be quite powerful in selling. So again, it's not direct in a way, but it's a way to absolutely generate a lot of traffic to your website where then you can take it from there.
That's really, really interesting. So, I mean, is this sort of, clearly this must be a subset area of specialization in SEO. I mean, are there professionals who are dealing exclusively with this stuff that you can kind of retain as a business owner to come in and effectively improve the dissemination of your product?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's content marketing professionals out there that you can hire. And actually, it's not really that expensive, or it shouldn't be that expensive. But I want to give you a couple of examples just from COVID, because I did come across recently an article on the increase in content marketing during COVID and some of the creative things that businesses have done. So, I mean, one example is a barber shop in the US. I mean, during the lockdowns, the barber shop is closed. And, everyone had their COVID hair after not getting a haircut for a long period of time. So, the barber shop did a video showing people how to cut their hair at home. How to at least, not do a fancy involved haircut, but how to do something simple that sort of deals with your issue. And at that time, with barbershops closed, this is something that people were looking for. So that kind of a content marketing page or article can do really well. And then they get to know your brand. Again, it's not a direct sale, right? They're just giving you some advice for how to deal with something. But there's a lot of goodwill behind that. Another example, if it's a restaurant that you have that's online and you've been closed for a long time, I mean, maybe you throw up a recipe for one of your recommended dishes, or one of the things that you happen to make at the restaurant that's really popular that you don't mind actually getting the recipe out there on. But stuff like this, and it helps. It really does help. It helps from a branding perspective, but ultimately this is done for a sales perspective, because you do want to see a return on investment in creating this, because it's not easy. It's not easy to just sit down and write an article that's valuable, that has information that people are looking for, that's credible. It's not something you just sort of whip off the top of your head. But the benefits are big, and it's well known that it's spreading quickly, and it's quite prominent. It's quite prominent already. I see it on a lot of businesses' websites, usually under a blog page. They'll call it a blog. But it's definitely something that I think businesses have to keep in mind, because there's communications benefits here too, aside from just the sales side.
Well, and as I know you're in the business of words, Cameron, as a PR and communications guy, I suspect that if there's an opportunity to sort of manipulate this line of business, this line of work, that there are people that are out there doing that. I mean, this sounds sort of ripe for opportunity to sort of make kind of bold accusations or disclaimers, or raise issues to try and put your business ahead of competitors. I mean, have we seen much in the way of sort of manipulation of this product in that regard?
No. This industry may evolve for sure. I mean, maybe it will go down this path, but I think people don't respond well to negativity if you're sort of slamming a competitor. What I do see, especially on some software websites, is they will create a page saying, our product versus A, and they'll name the competitor and actually do a comparison of the two. But when you read them, they do look legit. Like, you can see they're favoring their own product, but it's close enough that if you didn't know, you would say that it was an unbiased report. They will praise the other product. They will, put prices in there, even if it's less than their product, that sort of thing. But you can use words, like you said, to just manipulate enough to say, but overall, our product is the one that does these things that are the most important. And so there's a way to kind of bring that together. So it's a very lucrative field. There are people out there doing it, and I don't want to give away the store here, but it's become such a big industry, Ewan. There are services, of which I do use one, where you can type in tennis rackets or employment law or like I said, ice hockey skates or whatever it might be. And the software will go out there, find the questions that are being asked in search engines, index those, then go out and search for credible information on those subjects and compile it into a page for you automatically. So we're talking about like sourced links that you'll have to sort of fix it up so it's a finished article. But it gives you a draft or a blueprint that already has the key questions on social, the key facts that you want to include in the article, and all of the links and sources to that. It's quite incredible, actually.
Wow, that sounds insane. So let me ask you this, Cam. Any sort of neophytes such as myself in this regard, and anybody else out there who's running a business, I mean, what would you recommend as sort of a first step in terms of trying to wade into these waters?
So, I mean, one thing I've done in my career a lot, and I did at the Exchange, and we're now doing it in my current role at Tencent as well. I do think now that companies, to some degree, I mean, depends on the industry they're in, obviously, and the resource and staffing levels, but every company is a media company to some degree. And I mean, this has been said for a while, but I think this is a good example of that. So if you're just getting started, I mean, I think my advice is to just create a blog, on your website, create a page where you can write articles and publish them. It doesn't need to be complicated. But think about the issues in your industry. And I would start that way because you do want to ease into it. You're not going to go for all the data and all the stuff right off the top. I do think you should start this way. And then over time, there are tools where you can search to find out what is happening, what people are asking for, what are hot topics, and then begin to sort of tailor some of your content to those things. The real benefit here, Ewan, which I haven't mentioned, is cost, because technically you don't need to hire anyone. There is going to be some time cost of putting this stuff together. But when you consider the costs for advertising or client retention or, getting new clients or new customers, that does cost a lot. And content marketing is one way that is quite low cost that you have complete control over and that you can use to bring people sort of into your orbit and into your business. And that's probably the number one reason why it's so effective. And there's a lot of spin-offs here too. So again, if you're a company and you're on social media, as most businesses are now, if you create a blog article or you create a slideshow or a video tutorial of something, I mean, once it's on your website, you can also use that to push out on social and get people to sort of click through and read it that way and add you. So there's a lot of knock-on effects here where you get a lot of benefit from it.
I think my biggest takeaway from what you just said was every company is a media company. And that really sort of resonated with me. The idea that it doesn't really matter what you're doing anymore. If you run a business in this day and age, then you are a media company to some example because you have a footprint online. That's kind of a scary thought. Actually.
Yeah, it is. One of the things I often try and fight against, especially with people who've been in business for a very long time, is the idea that you do a news release and then you've got social media separately or your blog separately. And this is a historical way to look at it. But it's not relevant at all. Like, what is a press release? A press release is something that you write and put on your website and you email out or you fax out, or used to do. That could be a blog post. It could be anything, right? It's just we call it a news release, and because it's a news release, we write it in a certain way. But when I talk to companies, I try to get them to rethink this entire thing. Content is what you need to create, because content is going to allow you to promote your business. It's going to allow you to prepare for crisis communications, to build an audience that begins to trust you. And if something bad happens down the line, you've got direct access to them. You don't have to rely on a TV station or a newspaper to filter your information before it gets to the public or to your customers. So these are all reasons why you would want to do content marketing.
That's great advice. When we're done this show, Cam, I want to compare calendars and book a session with you to try and get this up and running with my business a bit better.
I honestly, this is me because I'm a bit of a computer nerd as well, but I do find it interesting. And I think because I like things where you can see the result immediately. Like if you write a couple of articles and you post them, it takes a few days for Google to index impacts it. But pretty quickly, you can see the results of your work. And along these lines, Ewan, I mean, we've just launched a newsletter for this podcast, but that's another thing that businesses can do as well. And it's not that you have to send them something every week or every month, but you get their email address, it goes into a database, and you don't know what's going to happen down the line. You know, COVID happened, for instance. Like, there might be times when you need to communicate directly with your clients, and this gives you an opportunity to do that. So that's why it's valuable for sure.
Yeah, that's a really good point, right? You don't know. It's that idea of you don't know what the impact is going to be. I mean, I think, my partners that I work with, they're brilliant lawyers, really, really at the top of their game. But we're not particularly well versed in this kind of stuff. And sometimes that can be a bit of a barrier in terms of trying to market these ideas or put them forward as something that businesses should engage with, because they don't have that sort of experience, and I don't have that sort of experience. So it can often be a tough sell. But I think you raise a really, really good point that, the sky's sort of the limit here, and you don't necessarily know what that impact is going to be until you take that, first step off the ledge into the deep, dark unknown, Cam, right?
Two final points here. I think another benefit of this is just that, I mean, it's much cheaper now to build a website or to add a blog to a website, almost zero if you already have a website. If you want to do a video update for your clients, or if you want to, do some sort of tutorial or talk, that is very reasonable to do. If you buy a live webcam, you can actually broadcast live on YouTube and Facebook and Twitter all at once, all for free. There's no cost to do this sort of thing. So, I mean, that's also extremely valuable. And then talking about business, we've talked about this before, and I don't think on the podcast though, but, there's a blog that we both read for a while called China Law Blog. And they've been around since 2006 or 2005. It's a very, very long time. But it's a tiny firm in rural Washington state. It's out in the boonies there somewhere. And this guy and his partner had been writing about, just legal issues in China and businesses going to China and the hurdles that they were trying to clear and those sorts of things. And as a result of them just writing this blog, they got major international business. And it's because they were seen over time as thought leaders, as people who know what they're talking about, that if you have to do something with China, you go to them. And I think in any business, that's what you ultimately want to become. You want to become the standard. You want to become the one place, the one firm, the one shop that people associate with the best. And, this is one way to do it. It doesn't happen overnight, but it can happen over time.
Great.
Wait a minute.
Check this out.
Whoa, hey, check this out. No, wait. Oh, check it out.
I want you to check this out.
On the PR and Law Podcast.
All right, Ewan, do you have any uplifting, exciting, positive things to talk about?
No.
Compared to last week.
Well, actually, sorry. I guess that's not entirely true. The latter shout out that I wanted to get to was just some really, really fantastic records that were released this week, Cam. Some weeks you just get an absolute wealth of new material, and there's so much sometimes it's difficult to dig into. So I'm just going to give some shout outs of a few names, and then I'll talk to my not so uplifting point.
Sure.
Matt Berninger, the front man for the National, pretty big. Once upon a time, a little known independent rock outfit from the US. They're now based out of Brooklyn. They've become huge. Matt's their front man. He just dropped his first solo record called Serpentine Prison. Mm-hmm. You should check it out. Kevin Morby, another really cool sort of, really kind of Laurel Canyon kind of vibe. He just dropped a record called Sundowner, which he interestingly recorded on a 4-track. So that's exactly what it sounds like, Cam, a good old fashioned reel to reel, where you can only put down a maximum of 4 tracks, and it all is just guitar, vocals, bass, drums. That's it. That's your 4 tracks on pretty much every song. And it's a really warm, kind of lazy Sunday afternoon kind of record. Check that out. And James Blake, if you want something a little more dancey, he dropped a really cool EP named or titled Before. So there's a few records for anybody who's interested in perusing the new music of the week.
Sorry, the Matt Berenger one, is it similar to the National, or does he have a different sound on his own?
It's probably, it is quite similar to sort of the more down tempo tracks that the National do. That's the overall vibe of the record. There's nothing really, really kind of crazy and raucous like what you might find on a National record. So yeah, if you're sort of into his more kind of down tempo vibe, I think you'll probably like this. He collaborated with Booker T. Jones, who, a lot of people might know, a really, really great musician that's just been around for decades. And somehow the two hooked up, and, his fingerprints are all over this record. It's a really just cool, well-produced kind of down tempo. Again, also sort of a Sunday afternoon, rainy day kind of record.
Nice. Yeah.
And now for my perhaps not quite as uplifting piece, I wanted to talk about an article that I read on BuzzFeed, actually, Cam, by and I hope I'm getting this author's name right. Scacchi, I think it's pronounced. It's spelled Scaachi. Cool. Koul is her last name.
Okay. Wait.
And the title is "That Photo of Billie Eilish Isn't Brave, It's Just Typical." I'm sure you saw this on social media, Cam. I think if you're on Twitter, you're on social media, I don't know how you could have missed it. There was a photo that came out of Billie Eilish, wearing a tank top, a pair of shorts and flip flops and socks, and people just kind of went berserk. Somebody on Twitter said in 10 months, Billie Eilish has developed a mid-30s wine mom body, despite the fact that, she's 18 years old, and there's just a lot of body shaming. And what was sort of interesting, and this is what this article sort of touches on, is that a lot of women very quickly chimed in, and some men, to say that, Eilish was being brave, in having a body that's sort of atypical for celebrities. And she really, really pushes back on this notion that doing so is somehow brave. That being considered brave for living in a particular type of body suggests that body, whatever shape and size, is somehow always functioning at a disadvantage. As if Eilish is weakened by her very average looking arms and normal circumference torso. That's part of a quote. And I just wanted to read this rest. This is a quote from the article, and then I'll leave it there. But quote, "There isn't anything brave about Eilish having the body of an adult woman, no more brave than it is for someone to have brown hair or green eyes. Calling someone brave for merely existing in the body they have doesn't take power away from thinness, and it doesn't create any kind of equilibrium in culture. There might be no bravery involved, just genetics. It's just a body, and you get the one you get. It has no moral value on its own. Insisting upon being alive and comfortable isn't ballsy. It's just a far better option than self-loathing." And I really think she hits the nail on the head here, Cam. This idea that, it's somehow brave to walk around in your own skin. We're sending the wrong message again and again and again about women's bodies. And really, it is women's bodies, because let's be honest, this is not really an issue that comes up very often with men. And we've got to switch the channel. We got to get the message right on this.
I think this is a whole other discussion. There's several things in there that would be good discussion points. But obviously we're not going to go through all of it, but I did just call the article up, but yeah, I'm definitely going to read this, because it is fascinating topic, actually. I just had two quick things to mention today. One of them's actually a portrait. I don't know if you saw this, Ewan, Queen Elizabeth II. She has a new Canadian portrait. So this is to be hung basically in all of our sort of government facilities in Canada as our sovereign. So she's wearing the Canadian insignia as the Sovereign of the Order of Canada and Order of Military Merit. It's a great photo. It's not often that we, especially outside of Canada, think of it as a member of the Commonwealth or as the Queen being our head of state. ultimately. But this is a reminder of that, and that tie is still quite strong. And the picture is great. So I'll put a link in the show notes on that one.
Well, just on that point, Cam, wasn't there a bit of a controversy around this? Because as I understand, for this photo, she was wearing the Belgium sapphire tiara.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And then I guess, Canadians being Canadians were probably upset about that to some degree. But
yeah, I know she was wearing it. I don't know about the controversy in Canada. Unfortunately, I don't get a lot of that news over here.
Yes, we are a fickle bunch sometimes. Very, very sensitive, us Canadians,
And the second one, you and I have talked about this offline. I think it's come up on the show once. It's the issue of Taiwan, and I'm honestly quite concerned. I don't want to sound like the wacko uncle out there, but we have a lot of evidence to suggest that China is looking at a military invasion of Taiwan soon. There's an article in the South China Morning Post today titled "Chinese Military Beefs Up Coastal Forces as it Prepares for Possible Invasion of Taiwan." There's been a lot happening on the coast. Not to go into too much detail on this podcast, but China got a new president in 2012, Xi Jinping. He has moved quickly to basically make him the Mao of present day China. He's now president for life. He got rid of the term limits. He's consolidated power to a very high degree, and he has said from day one that he will be the person who reunites Taiwan with China. And he said it openly. He said it openly many times. And based on sort of China's behavior in Xinjiang, in Tibet, what they did here in Hong Kong, in my own view, it's showing very little regard for world opinion. It's no longer constrained by that. And with some of the chaos in the United States around the election, and with COVID still running rampant, and with problems in many parts of the world, it's creating some pretty fertile ground for China to move on this.
Yeah, well, you and I have talked about this many, many times, mostly off air. As you know, I lived in Taipei, Taiwan for a couple of years. Mm-hmm. It's just a really incredible place. And again, we don't have time for me to talk about all of the merits of how wonderful Taiwan is. But this just, it breaks my heart, and it makes me really, really concerned. I still have a number of friends there, but just for the Taiwanese people who have really been doing such a fantastic, incredible, admirable job over the last few decades in building a really, really, really fruitful and stable democracy. I'm really, really terrified as to where this is gonna end.
Yeah, and I noticed that it's kind of been happening in the background because there's so much going on around the world that, I've lived over here since 2004. Usually when there's moves towards Taiwan, or there's sort of increasing tensions in the Taiwan Strait, it gets quite prominent international coverage. But this is kind of flying below the radar a little bit, just because, we are in a U.S. presidential election cycle, and COVID is around, and there's other sort of race issues happening in the U.S. and Europe is not in a good economic state at the moment. I don't think this is getting the attention it deserves, because I think if China does go in there and take it with force, the world is heading to a dark place. And so, yes, it is concerning. I don't want to be, like I say, waving the flag and jumping up and down and saying we should panic. But I do think this is something we should pay attention to.
Great. So let's leave
on that
it there.
Note,
on that really wonderful, uplifting note.
Anything you want to chime in with, Ewan, to end on a positive note?
No, I'm just sad now. I'm just sad. But
go listen to those new albums that dropped. That'll be that maybe it'll cheer you up a bit. And for the listeners too. Yeah, give it a shot. So we have come to the end of episode 28. I still can't believe we've done this many shows already. It feels like we just started. But we do appreciate you joining Ewan and I on the show. It does mean a lot to us, and it's great to see the numbers continuing to increase. It's huge support. So you can follow us on social media to not miss a show. Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. We're also on YouTube and SoundCloud. And I mentioned our newsletter. Please sign up for this. We are sending out notifications of new episodes, and we intend to send out other show news later, but we will not spam you or sell your email address or do anything like that. It's perfectly secure. So thank you again. For you and Christy, this is Cam McMurchie. Light it up.
This has been the PR and Law Podcast with Cam McMurchie and Ewan Christie. If you enjoyed the show, please share it with a friend or leave a review. You can also join us on LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook by following our account at PRLawPodcast. That's all one word, PRLAW Podcast. Thanks for your support.